The mist over Blackthorn Manor had not yet lifted when fear found its way into a young maid's hands. It showed itself only in the smallest tremble of a silver tray, not enough to rattle the porcelain cups resting upon it, not enough for anyone passing in the corridor to notice. But she noticed. She always noticed the small things now. 5 years of hiding had taught her that survival depended on catching the tremor before anyone else could. 5 years had passed since the kingdom last spoke the name Queen Elara aloud within these palace walls. 5 years since the river was said to have swallowed her whole and given nothing back. To every noble family, every servant, every soul in the kingdom, their gentle Lina was gone, mourned and buried in memory, if not in body. Only she knew otherwise. She had not died in that river. She had simply understood, in the desperate hours after her wedding night nearly killed her, that surviving sometimes meant disappearing entirely, becoming someone smaller, someone forgettable, someone the world would never think to look for twice. Now, they called her Lina, an ordinary maid with rough hands from years of scrubbing, plain brown hair tucked beneath a servant's bonnet, and eyes trained never to linger too long on anyone of importance. It was exactly as the old enchantment required of her. Invisible, forgettable, safe, or so she had believed right up until this particular morning. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And if this is your first time with us, go ahead and press that subscribe button so you don't miss what's still to come. The head steward had come rushing into the servants' hall before the sun had fully risen, his voice booming off the stone walls loud enough to silence every conversation in the room. His Majesty has arrived. Every servant froze for half a heartbeat before scrambling into motion. The Alpha King had come to Blackthorn Manor. For most of the household, this was thrilling news, the kind of event servants would speak of for years. For Lina, it landed like the reading of her own death sentence. She stood rooted to the spot while the younger maids around her whispered with barely contained excitement. The king was searching for a new Lina, they said. Every noble family within 100 miles hoped their daughter might catch his eye. And still, after 5 years, he wore black every single day, mourning a wife the kingdom believed long dead. Lina nearly dropped the bowl in her hands. Still wears black. That detail did not fit the story she had told herself for 5 years. A man who had poisoned his own bride on their wedding day did not spend half a decade in mourning for her. Did he? Before she could steady her thoughts, the steward's gaze landed directly on her. Lina, you've always had the steadiest hands in this household. You'll personally serve His Majesty today. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Somewhere behind her, another maid laughed softly and called an honor. If only she knew. 5 years earlier, Lina had not carried tea toward that man. She had walked toward him in ivory silk with moonflowers woven through her hair, believing with her whole heart that she was beginning the happiest day of her life. She had been wrong. Terribly, dangerously wrong. Outside the grand receiving chamber, she stopped to steady her breathing. Beyond the heavy oak doors, she could hear laughter, the polished conversation of nobles and council members and the daughters of wealthy families, all of them hoping to witness the beginning of a new royal engagement. Everyone in that room was hoping for a future. Everyone except the one woman who had already stood exactly where that future bride would stand and had nearly died for it. She pressed her fingers to the small moonstone pendant hidden beneath her collar. It had kept her safe for 5 years, a gift from the old healer who had pulled her from the edge of death and hidden her ever since. As long as she wore it, anyone who had known Queen Elara would see only Lina. Not another face laid over her own, but a shift in what people believed they were seeing. It had never once failed her. She took a slow breath, lifted the tray, and pushed open the doors. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of the receiving hall, catching on crystal chandeliers and polished silver. The gathered nobles smiled and murmured pleasantries. It looked, in almost every detail, like the hall on her wedding day 5 years before. Except for him. The Alpha King stood near the great fireplace, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black, his dark cloak hanging still behind him like the folded wings of some quiet, watchful bird. He looked older than she remembered, not weaker, harder, in the particular way that only comes from years of sleepless nights and silent regret. Faint silver had crept into his temples. Small scars marked one of his hands. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes had changed. Once cold enough to still a room, they now carried an exhaustion no crown could disguise. She lowered her gaze and reminded herself, sharply, not to feel anything close to pity for this man. Remember the poison, she told herself. Remember collapsing to the floor. Remember believing, in that final blurred moment, that you were dying. She crossed the room quietly, pouring tea for guest after guest, invisible exactly as the charm intended, until she reached him. The air around him felt different, warmer, heavier, alive in a way she could not explain. She poured his tea without spilling a drop, set the cup beside him, and stepped back precisely as protocol demanded. Then a deep voice stopped her cold. You. Every muscle in her body locked in place. The rest of the room continued its idle laughter, unaware that a single word had just stolen the air from her lungs. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. He was looking directly at her, not past her, the way nobility so often looked through servants without truly seeing them. At her, his expression had gone distant, as though he were reaching for a memory hidden somewhere behind an ordinary face. Neither of them moved for several long seconds. Then, in a voice low enough that only she could hear it, he asked the question that would unravel everything she had built over 5 careful years. Have we met before? The tray nearly slipped from her trembling hands. I'm afraid not, Your Majesty, she managed, her voice somehow steady, even as her pulse thundered in her ears. I only joined this household a few years ago. He studied her a moment longer, confusion written plainly across his face, before a nearby duke called his attention away toward a hopeful young noblewoman named Lady Rosalind. The spell of the moment broke. Lina bowed and slipped quietly back among the servants lining the walls, and only once she reached the empty corridor did she finally allow herself to breathe. He felt it, she whispered to no one. He actually felt it. That had never happened before. The enchantment was not supposed to allow even a flicker of recognition. And yet something in him had reached toward her anyway, something the magic had never quite managed to erase. Inside the hall, the king remained rooted to the same spot long after she had gone, his advisors discussing trade routes and marriage alliances without receiving a single word of his attention. His captain, a steady, weathered man named Marcus, noticed immediately. You seem distracted, Your Majesty. I'm thinking. Marcus knew better than to press further. After nearly 20 years serving beside this man, he understood the particular silence that came just before something important surfaced. That servant, the king finally said. How long has she served this household? Nearly 5 years, I believe. 5 years. Always that number. 5 years since his queen had vanished into the river. 5 years, and somehow this servant girl's eyes carried the exact same quiet sadness his late wife's had. This is foolish, he murmured to himself, and said nothing more. But deep within him, something restless refused to settle. In the kitchens, Lina found the only person in the manor who knew the full truth of who she really was. Betsy had once served as head housekeeper within the royal palace itself, the very woman who had pulled her half-conscious body from danger and hidden her ever since. To the rest of the household, she was simply an elderly servant. To Lina, she was the closest thing to family she had left. You saw him, Betsy said the moment she stepped through the doorway. He looked at me. He asked if we'd met before. Color drained from Betsy's face. That isn't possible. The charm has never failed. Lina pulled the moonstone pendant free from beneath her collar. It still shimmered faintly, the enchantment clearly intact. Then why, Lina whispered, did he look at me like that? Neither of them had an answer. That evening, the manor prepared for a grand banquet, and Lina found herself unable to escape her own memories no matter how hard she worked. Every hallway reminded her of another palace, Another feast, another version of herself who had been only 21, hopeful, and certain that love could be built slowly out of duty and patience. She remembered her father's final words to her before the wedding, urging her to be patient, reminding her that kings carried burdens ordinary people could never fully understand. She remembered lifting a golden goblet to her lips that day. The warmth, the sudden dizziness. The room began to spin. Hands reached for her as she collapsed, and through blurred, fading vision, the face of her new husband, not smiling, not celebrating, but horrified. Had she imagined that horror? For 5 years, she had remembered only betrayal. Now, for the first time, doubt crept into her heart, and she hated how much she needed to know the answer. Elsewhere in the manor, the king stood alone on a moonlit balcony, having slipped away from his own banquet without anyone noticing. Marcus found him there, staring toward the dark line of the forest beyond the estate walls. "Have you ever looked at a stranger?" the king asked quietly, "and felt as though losing them once had nearly ended you?" Marcus said nothing for a long moment, searching the face of the strongest alpha in the kingdom, a man every noble feared, and saw instead something closer to grief, raw and entirely unhidden. "I have not," Marcus admitted, "but I think you just described exactly that." Hidden in the shadows far below that balcony, unseen by either man, a hooded figure watched everything unfold with quiet satisfaction. "So," the figure whispered into the dark, "she survived after all." Morning came wrapped in silver mist, and Lina had barely slept, the king's question echoing through her mind until dawn broke over the courtyard. She tied her bonnet with trembling fingers and told her reflection in a copper basin to simply get through the day unnoticed. Fate, as it turned out, had other plans. That morning, she was assigned to the manor's old library, the quietest room in the estate, filled with towering shelves of dust-covered volumes. She welcomed the solitude and, for the first time since the king's arrival, allowed herself something close to a smile. Books had always been her refuge, even during her brief time as queen, when the pressures of court had become unbearable. While reaching for an old leather-bound history, a folded piece of parchment slipped free and fluttered to the floor. She unfolded it and felt her breath catch. It was a poem written in her own hand 5 years earlier on the night before her wedding, hidden inside a book after she decided it was too personal to ever hand to anyone. "If duty brings us together before affection does, then let kindness be our first promise. Love cannot be commanded, but perhaps with patience it can be invited." Tears blurred her vision as she read her own forgotten words. She had been so young, so naive to believe kindness alone could carry a marriage forward. Unseen beyond the library's half-open door, someone had been quietly watching her read every line. Meanwhile, Marcus moved through the household, questioning staff on the king's behalf, gathering nothing but praise for Lina's character until he reached the estate's oldest gardener, who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that birds trusted her in ways he had never seen before. Every morning, he said, the robins followed her, landing freely on her shoulders without a hint of fear. His grandmother, he added, used to say that nature always recognized a true queen. Marcus dismissed it as old folklore, though the feeling it left behind proved harder to shake than he expected. That afternoon, the manor prepared for a hunt through the surrounding forest, and Lina hoped the king's absence might finally grant her a few hours of peace. Dressed for riding rather than ceremony, he emerged from the manor and, before mounting his horse, allowed his gaze to drift across the rows of gathered servants until it found her. He crossed the courtyard directly toward her, ignoring the steward's confused protest, and stopped only a few feet away. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said. "My name is Lina, Your Majesty," she answered, curtsying. He repeated her name slowly, as though testing its shape. At that exact moment, a small robin swept down from a nearby tree and landed gently on her shoulder without the slightest hesitation. The courtyard fell quiet. The bird chirped happily, entirely unafraid, and something inside the king's chest seemed to lurch violently at the sight of it. Years ago, another robin had landed on another shoulder, belonging to a woman who laughed every spring as birds gathered fearlessly around her in the palace gardens. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "My father loved birds," she said. "He taught me patience." It was a believable answer. It did not feel complete. He studied her a moment longer before finally allowing Marcus to guide him back toward the waiting hunting party, though not before promising, quietly, that their conversation was far from finished. Those words chilled her more than anything else that day. High above the courtyard, hidden behind an attic window, the hooded figure had watched every detail unfold, including the robin, including the king's reaction. The figure's satisfaction curdled into unease. "This is becoming dangerous," they murmured, withdrawing a small crystal etched with old runes from beneath their cloak. Its surface glowed a dull red as they whispered into it. "He remembers." A distorted voice answered from somewhere far away. "Then don't let the queen remember first." Back at the manor, Betsy pulled Lina aside into the quiet of the laundry wing, her voice low and urgent. "You need to leave," she said. "I watch his face today." That wasn't confusion. That was recognition. Lina's stomach tightened. The charm is still working. But when Betsy examined the moonstone pendant more closely, her expression darkened. Its glow had dimmed, only slightly, but enough for someone who understood magic to notice. "It wasn't like that yesterday," Lina said. "No," Betsy admitted. "It wasn't." She hesitated before adding the truth. She clearly did not want to speak aloud. The charm had never been built to last 5 years. It had been built only to last until the danger had been passed. Neither of them said what they were both suddenly afraid of, that the danger had never truly ended at all. Deep in Blackwood Forest, the king rode in near silence while nobles around him competed loudly for his attention. Marcus finally guided his horse alongside him and mentioned, carefully, that the household staff believed birds followed the young, made the same way they once followed his late queen. The king's horse stopped entirely. "Finish," he said quietly, when Marcus hesitated. "They say Queen Elara was the same." He said nothing more, though the memory of spring mornings in the palace garden, birds landing fearlessly on his wife's shoulders while he pretended not to smile, settled heavily over him for the remainder of the ride. That afternoon, a little girl from the kitchen staff found Lina crying quietly in the manor's abandoned chapel, and, in the innocent way only children manage, led her toward the old, forgotten royal garden after showing her a small silver button she discovered, one that unmistakably belonged to the ceremonial cloak the king had worn on his wedding day. The garden had been reclaimed almost entirely by nature, save for one thing left untouched. The old moon fountain at its center, still surrounded by fresh white lilies that could not have been sitting there for long. When Lina asked who tended this place, the girl answered simply that the sad king came every year, that he spoke to somebody by the water, that sometimes he cried. Before Lina could fully process what she'd just heard, heavy footsteps approached from beyond the hedges, and the king himself stepped into the garden. The little girl, delighted and entirely unaware of the storm she was about to unleash, looked between the two adults and beamed. "See? I told you she'd come back." The silence that followed swallowed the entire garden hole. The king's expression did not change, but something inside him cracked. It was not the child's innocent mistake that undid him. It was the sight of the young maid standing exactly where his late wife had always stood beside that fountain. The same folded hands, the same tilt of the head, even the same loose strand of hair caught by the evening breeze. He asked her, gently, where she had been born. She answered with the same rehearsed lie she had told for years, a small village near the western cliffs, and though he nodded, something in his eyes suggested he no longer believed her story quite so easily. That evening, deep beneath the manor, Betsy revealed something that shook Lina to her core. The old royal garden, and that very fountain, had belonged to the two of them long before their wedding. Every evening in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, believing herself unnoticed, Lina had sat beside that water, reading quietly aloud to herself. What she had never known was that the king, Rather than attending the council meetings everyone assumed occupied his evenings, had hidden himself nearby in the rose arbor and listened to every single word, never once revealing himself. Why, Lina wondered, would a man secretly cherish moments like that only to poison the woman he'd been listening to the very next day? Nothing about that added up any longer. That night, during the royal banquet, the king quietly informed a hopeful noble family that he would not be considering a marriage after all, that he had honored their old agreement by attending, but that his decision remained unchanged. When pressed by an elderly duke about the kingdom's need for an heir, his answer silenced the entire hall. Because there has only ever been one queen. Hidden behind a service door, Lina heard every word and felt her knees weaken beneath her. If he wanted her dead, why remain loyal to her memory for 5 long years? There had to be another explanation. There had to be. High above the banquet hall, inside an abandoned tower chamber, the hooded figure watched all of it unfold through an enchanted mirror alongside another woman. This one unmasked, her pale eyes gleaming coldly in the torchlight. For 5 years, the woman said she hated the wrong man. Now she's beginning to question herself. Good. Doubt makes people careless, and careless people uncover truths they shouldn't. She lifted a small crystal vial filled with dark, swirling liquid. 5 years ago, she survived one poisoning, she murmured. No one survives twice. Later that night, as the banquet wound toward its end, a young kitchen girl handed Lina a beautifully sealed bottle of wine meant for the king's table. Something about it unsettled Lina immediately, an instinct she hadn't felt since the moment before her own wedding cup had betrayed her. She uncorked it carefully and caught the unmistakable scent hidden beneath the wine's rich aroma. Bitter almonds. She rushed the bottle straight to Betsy, who confirmed her fear within seconds. The poison was the very same one used 5 years earlier. Whoever had poisoned her at her wedding had never stopped operating within these walls. Meanwhile, alone in the library, the king had opened the very same book that had once concealed Lina's forgotten poem, and this time discovered the letter itself. He recognized her handwriting instantly and read her words with his voice cracking under the weight of 5 years of unspoken grief. He confessed quietly to Marcus, been writing his own reply the night before the wedding, wanting the words to be worthy of her, and had simply run out of time. Carrying the poisoned bottle hidden beneath a cloth, Lina hurried through the corridor to find him and warn him, and rounded the final corner directly into his path. When he asked what she was carrying, she made the only choice her conscience would allow. "Please don't drink the wine," she told him. "Someone has tried to poison you." The recognition that crossed his face in that instant had nothing to do with fear. It was memory, pure and sudden, pulling him straight back to his wedding hall, to the moment his bride collapsed into his arms, whispering his name before the darkness took her. Only one person had ever warned him about poison before that night. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She never had the chance to answer. A crossbow bolt tore through the darkness of the corridor, aimed directly at her heart. The king moved before conscious thought could catch up to him, pulling her against his chest as the bolt shattered harmlessly against the stone wall behind them. Chaos erupted through the manor within seconds, guards flooding the halls, candles crashing to the floor, and somewhere beneath the estate, hurried footsteps disappearing into passages no one had used in years. The assassin escaped into the dark, but the metal tip of that bolt carried the same faint blue stain as the poisoned wine. "Nightshade ash," Marcus confirmed grimly. The very same. In the quiet council chamber that followed, the king finally laid everything before her, an entire leather journal filled with 5 years of searching, sketches of the wedding hall, lists of every servant who had touched that fatal cup, and page after page of a single desperate question written over and over. Who changed the queen's cup? He told her of finding the antidote vial empty in the royal infirmary, proof that someone had planned her death long before the ceremony ever began. He told her he had searched every river, every forest, every village, refusing another Luna because he could not bury a promise he'd never had the chance to keep. "I hated you," she told him honestly. "I know. I wished terrible things upon you. I lived through most of them anyway," he answered, with the faintest, most exhausted smile she had ever seen. A guard interrupted them moments later with news that a hidden tunnel had been discovered beneath the East Wing, occupied by a man believed dead for 5 years, the former royal chancellor. Deep within that tunnel, they uncovered proof of a conspiracy far larger than a single poisoning, forged decrees, bribed officials, and a sealed letter revealing the true motive behind it all. As long as the Queen lives, the prophecy cannot be broken. It was Betsy who finally explained what neither of them had ever known, that the women of Lina's bloodline had never been chosen for their titles alone, but because they carried an old blessing passed down through generations. The small crescent-shaped mark she had carried beneath her collarbone since birth began to glow with a soft silver light, and the enchantment that had hidden her true face for 5 years finally released its hold. Standing before them once more, exactly as the kingdom remembered her, was Queen Elara herself. The king crossed the room slowly, not as a ruler, but simply as a man who had spent 5 years mourning something he had never actually lost. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he told her. "No," she said honestly, "you don't. But you deserve the truth," she continued, "and so do I. The lies stole 5 years from both of us. We can't reclaim them, but we can decide what happens tomorrow." For the first time in 5 long years, his smile finally reached his eyes. News of a living queen spread through the kingdom faster than anyone could have predicted. Villages that had worn mourning ribbons for half a decade quietly took them down. Days later, she stood beside him on the palace balcony wearing no crown, exactly as she had asked, so that her people might see her not as a symbol, but as someone who had simply survived. The trial that followed exposed the full weight of the conspiracy, forged decrees, bribed nobles, and a plot to plunge the kingdom into chaos that had begun the very night of her wedding. When it finally ended, she asked him honestly why he hadn't simply buried it all to keep the peace. "Because a truth hidden today only becomes another lie tomorrow," he answered. "And I've had enough of those to last several lifetimes." That evening, she returned alone to the old moon fountain, the one place in the kingdom untouched by everything that had happened since. When he found her there, she told him plainly that the 2 people who had stood at that fountain 5 years earlier were gone, and that whatever came next between them would have to be chosen freely by 2 equals, rather than assumed by a king and his queen. "I have been waiting a very long time to hear you say that," he told her quietly. The years that followed brought a kind of healing no single decree could have manufactured. Schools were built for children the conspiracy had orphaned. Councils opened their doors to farmers and craftsmen alongside nobility. Trust, they both discovered, could only be rebuilt the same slow way it had been broken, one honest day at a time. Years later, a young servant girl asked the queen how she had ever found it in herself to forgive him. Elara looked out toward the palace gardens, where children's laughter drifted up from beneath the flowering trees, and answered simply that she had not forgiven him because the pain had stopped. She had forgiven him because she refused to let someone else's cruelty decide the rest of her life for her. As twilight settled over the palace that evening, the Alpha King found her once more beside the moon fountain, exactly where he always knew to look. Above them, a new moon rose slowly into a clear sky, not as proof that the past had been erased, but as a quiet reminder that every new beginning carries within it the wisdom of everything that came before. And in that stillness, they both finally understood what neither of them had known 5 years earlier on their wedding day. That love is not strongest when it has never been broken. It is strongest when it chooses, with open eyes, to grow again after the truth has finally been allowed to come to light.